Dear guests, dear friends, I would like to welcome you all to this opening of the exhibition Making Africa. I've just explained to our German guests that as we have so many international guests here tonight, we will have the whole event in English, and different from how our openings usually happen, we will have all the speeches now and no speeches later in the museum, so you can fully enjoy the exhibition. We'll listen to a discussion with Amelie Klein, our exhibition curator of Making Africa, and Okwui Enwezor, who is the director of Haus der Kunst in Munich. He was a curator of the Venice Biennale in 2002, and is the documenta in 2002, and is the artistic director of the Venice Biennale this year, of course, and I think probably one of the people who have the most profound knowledge of the artistic and cultural landscape in Africa. So we're really happy to have you here tonight, Okwe. After myself, Uta Schnell from the German Cultural Foundation will also say a few words because the German Cultural Foundation has been supporting the exhibition. Just a few words about the exhibition. As a Vitra Design Museum, we are showing exhibitions that want to show how closely design is linked to our societies, to our today's political and technological circumstances. We want to show exhibitions that create connections between the past, the present, and the future. We want to show exhibitions that question what we believe to know, and that destroy cliches, and that build cultural bridges. We want to show exhibitions that show the close link between design and other disciplines like art, like architecture, even urbanism. And we also want to show the roots of design in collective cultures and situations, and yet its potential for a great author to develop a highly individual position out of this. And all this is true for the exhibition Making Africa. The idea to do this exhibition started from the fact that there have been enormous changes on the continent in Africa in the past 10 years. While in the 1980s and 90s, there were decades of economical and political struggles, Africa is currently a place with an incredibly fast development in politics, in social structures, in technologies, and also in culture. There is a growing middle class. The growth rates of many countries' economies are far over 5%, sometimes over 10%. Wireless infrastructure is often better developed than here. There are cities like Lagos or Nairobi who have great and emerging startup scenes, to mention only a few examples for the great change that is currently happening on the continent. And all this is the background for the exhibition Making Africa. And so it was clear that with this in mind, we did not want to do another exhibition about material folklore or about humanitarian design, showing water filters and solar cookers. Because rather than looking at the problems, we wanted to show the possibilities of this continent. And rather than showing solutions that are imported from good-willing Western designers, we wanted to show the great design works that are emerging from the continent itself at the moment and which merit to be better known on a global level. To do so, we deliberately chose works from the most diverse disciplines, including product and furniture design, of course, but also typography, digital design, street art, even often digital media design, and many works that we show in the exhibition, you couldn't even tell whether they are design or art or something in between. And that is exactly what the exhibition is about. It's about an open understanding of design that does not limit itself to definitions which have often been made by Western people in the 20th or even in the 19th century already. But we want to make visible how a new context in the 21st century is bringing about new works, crossing the disciplines and reaching out into society in Africa. Of course, we were aware that we cannot show one homogeneous African design or even something like a coherent style, because we're speaking about a continent with 45 countries, thousands of cultures and ethnies and languages. So, of course, you would never dare to show one single tendency, but what we can show is that there are new collective experiences and themes that become visible, and they become especially visible because the exhibition confronts works from different disciplines so that you can see what are the narratives that run through those different objects from those different fields. And you also see in the exhibition that design in Africa, but also everywhere else at the moment, is seen as much more than just to solve daily problems and to improve furniture or objects that we use. Design also has the function to speculate about our collective future, to question things, to mirror identities, to reflect on everyday culture, to experiment with new technologies. And all this, which is true for design all over the world today, could not be shown better than by looking at design in Africa. Now, this sounds like a very ambitious program, and that was the exhibition indeed. So, to prepare it, just to give you some figures, Amelie Klein, our curator, traveled 6 times for quite a long period to African countries, of course, to many of the big cities, but also to rural areas. In all these cities, she organized think tanks and gatherings with designers, often supported by the local Goethe institutes. She interviewed more than 70 designers, artists, architects, scholars, and thinkers. She visited studios, workshops, museums, companies, fab labs, and she insisted that she also went to hacker spaces. She might explain what that is for her later. And she brought together an exhibition with 280 objects by 120 different designers. And I think also only these sheer figures show that, of course, the exhibition wants to make a relevant statement about what is happening on the continent today, even if it does not show one single view, but many different approaches. I'm really happy that many of the people that are featured in the exhibition are here tonight, and I just want to mention those that I know of, and if there are some others, you may raise your hands and say that you've been forgotten. I want to very warmly welcome Caro Akpokere, François Borin, Nicolas Sillon, Ndeye Nafissatou Diop, Omar Victor Diop, Amadou Fatoumata Ba, Yinka Ilori, Hector Mediavilla, Dr. Ngom, Sindizo Neoni, Ifeanyi Oganvu, Justin Plunkett, Bai Sulai, Daniele Tamagni, and Hisham Lalou. And I also want to mention that one of these guests, Dr. Ngom from Dakar, he spent the whole last week on decorating our museum with a graffiti that brings something of the visual richness and intensity of the exhibition to the outside facade of our very pure white Frank Gehry architecture. And actually when he finished some days ago, we saw him standing in front of the under building and looking at the long concrete walls, saying, "This is a very nice wall too." Now to finish with, I also want to thank the many people who have made this project possible. Firstly, I want to thank the German Cultural Foundation, which is represented by Uta Schnell, who has supported the exhibition not only with a significant financial contribution, but also with a great knowledge that they have acquired during the past years, because the German Cultural Foundation had a whole fund over the last years that was focused only on projects about Africa. And so they have a whole network that was really helpful for us when we did the research for the exhibition. I also want to thank the Art Mentor Foundation from Lucerne in Switzerland, which also gave financial support to the exhibition. And these two partners were really helpful for us to realize the exhibition in that scale as we did it. Then I want to thank the advisory board that supported us with a lot of advice on a curatorial and research level, with Okwui Enwezor, but also Yelda Bayraktar, Pierre-Christophe Gam, Porky Heffer, Koyo Kuo, Hisham Lalou, Odessa Legema, Mugendi Mrita, and Azu Nwagbogu. So they were also of great help. Then I want to thank the Guggenheim Museum in Bilbao, which co-produced the exhibition with us, and which will show the exhibition right after our own presentation, starting from October onwards. And it's interesting that they also have a Frank Gehry building. I don't know if this is a coincidence, but they have much larger spaces. So I think it's a great reason to see the exhibition again at the Guggenheim in autumn. And then we're also happy that the exhibition will go on to continue to travel. It will go to the Centro de Cultura Contemporánea in Barcelona, and we have the chief curator, Rosa Ferrer, here with us tonight. And I know of a lot of other museum colleagues which are also with us here. And to me, that shows that the topic we are doing the exhibition about is seen as a very relevant topic. And I'm really looking forward to the discussion and the exchange with the other museum colleagues, what they think about the show. Last not least, I want to thank the huge exhibition team at the Vitra Design Museum that was involved in conceiving the exhibition. Let me start with the exhibition designers, Emil from Basel. They really developed a great scenography that underlines the messages of the exhibition in a wonderful way. And I want to thank the graphic designers, Double Standards, Chris Rehberger and his team, who designed a beautiful catalog, which unfortunately I don't have here with me now, but you will see it in the exhibition. You can't miss it because it's huge. In our museum, I want to thank Jörn Strücker for the coordination of the catalog, Vivian Stappmans and her team for the PR work, Stefanie Fricker and Ina Kläden and their great technical team for working until yesterday late at night to make everything work, and it does work actually. Susanne Grana and her team from the collection department for handling all the loans, and Sandra Bachmann for organizing the transports of the loans from the most different African and other destinations here to the Vitra Design Museum. And I can tell you it was not always sure that all the loans would arrive, but they did. Well, among all the team, my very special thanks go to the exhibition curator, Amelie Klein, with her two colleagues, Julia Friedl and Ronnie Chan. Amelie and her team did not only travel like crazy in the past 2 years, I have to say it like that, but she also developed a highly reflected and precise exhibition concept, and she insisted on the exhibition being very outspoken, as she is herself, sharp, even sometimes provocative. And after so many discussions we had about this, I have to say that she was right to do so. And I thank her for her sturdiness, which sometimes breaks your nerve, but leads to great results. So thanks a lot for that. Well, last not least, I want to thank the man who was the most important discussion partner for Amelie and myself when developing the concept, our advising curator, Okwui Enwezor. Every meeting with Okwui was a boost of inspiration for us, with names and themes and research ideas and contacts, and you could contact this person and think about that. And these inputs were extremely important for the exhibition to become what it is. I think, Amelie, you agree with that. For example, Okwui had the idea to create the many links from the contemporary works shown in the exhibition to the post-colonial era as an historical background for the show. He also insisted on avoiding cliches and preconception, which we of course were aware too, but he, with his great experience, was probably even more sensitive for. And at the same time, he encouraged us to not over-intellectualize the exhibition when it comes to the single works that we show, because they have their own language and they have their own force and they merit to be shown as they are and not be over-explained. And he did this with a very polite and yet very direct way, which was extremely helpful. And just to give you an example for how this worked, in one of our meetings, we sat in the cafe at Haus der Kunst in Munich, where he's the director of, and we told him about our latest findings, and we spoke about the many videos that there are in the internet about the song Happy by Pharrell Williams that you probably all know. And many people all over the world have created their own videos for that song, dancing in a certain context of a city. And we told him that there are these people in Nairobi and Cairo and Accra performing this song, this video, Happy. And we were just enthusiastic about that, and you were very cool, Okwe, and just said, well, listen, Matteo and Amelie, what I always wanted to ask you with regards to these videos, is there also a video version of Happy in Weil am Rhein? And that, you know, to me, that showed very clearly that, you know, we come from a certain standpoint, you know, of course, there are these videos on the web, and I can tell you that regarding these aspects of pop culture and music culture, it's rather us who can learn from the African continent than the other way around, and that was a very smart way to tell us that. So that was it. Now I hand over to Uta Schnell from the German Cultural Foundation.
Thank you very much, Matteo Kries. Dear Matteo, dear Amelie Klein, it's okay. Dear Okwui Enwezor, dear designers and artists from the continent, ladies and gentlemen. Matteo Kries already said it, I'm very happy to be here tonight, and I would like to welcome you on behalf of the German Cultural Foundation to the opening of the show, Making Africa a Continent of Contemporary Design. It was, I think, actually 3 years ago that Matteo Kries came to visit the foundation in Halle and told us about his idea to investigate the contemporary design scenes of the African continent. And tonight is the opening, and the foundation, we are very happy to be part of it, to fund it, for several reasons, which you will see later in the show. One reason, and one is that it's a premiere, as far as we know, because there hasn't actually been such a comprehensive, in-depth, collaborative exhibition on the subject of design from the African continent ever before in Germany. So we're very happy to be part of it. And to put up this show, the Vitra Museum, Matteo Kries already pointed it out, has immersed itself for 2 years in intense cross-continental exchange, in discussions, in talks, and I'm sure that that was as well the case in disputes, conflicts, and misunderstandings. That's great, actually, because this is exactly this kind of work what we wanted when the foundation was starting our Africa focus 4 years ago. Because we wanted to get cultural institutions, museums, theaters, publishers, festivals out of their Western comfort zones, both in curatorial and in artistic terms. Our intention was to encourage institutions to go beyond their European, US, American fixation and to inspire them to eventually get to know and get engaged with the artists on the African continent. We felt that this was necessary because a lot of German institutions continue to be unaware about the enormous cultural dynamics and change, and Matteo Kries was pointing it out just recently. They're not aware about these cultural dynamics on the continent. Just for example, who could name a couple of the thrilling novels coming from Nigeria off the cuff? Can you? Who is aware to what extent YouTube and smartphones influence the urban culture in Angola, or which choreographers in the DR Congo are showing fascinating productions? Surely there was, and maybe still is, an all too simplistic view of Africa. And I think we heard that for several times now, but one can't emphasize it enough that this is wrong. And as a consequence, artists and intellectuals from the continent tend to use the adjective African only very reluctantly when speaking to Europeans. Just recently, Ntoni Ijabe, the chief editor of the Chimurenga Chronic, which is actually featured in the catalogue as well, said that a lot of colleagues of his generations feel the need to explain once and once again that the continent must not be understood as a monolithic unit, rather that you have to acknowledge the differences and diversities of its 45 states and so many more cultures. Clearly, Ejabe speaks from personal experience, and I'm sure this experience is very often. However, I think that things are moving a little bit on and perceptions have changed. The German Cultural Foundation is supporting over 50 cooperations between institutions in Germany and museum, theater, festival, artists, designers in almost 40 African countries. That is more than ever before, And there is, and I'm very positive about that, more to come. Given the size of the continent, of course, this is but a small number indeed. However, it seems to us that German institutions whose curatorial programs had previously been hermetically European or US American at best, are following the African continent's example to finally open up and face the new global reality. And even if it's just very small steps, but we've got the impression, the foundation, that this is this exchange which has proven very fruitful for a long overdue criticism of Eurocentrism in this country. And to return just for once to Ntone Ejabe's distaste for the adjective African, I think it is surely a lesson to take home from this show. You will see in a moment that there is no such thing as African design. Matteo Kries has pointed it out already. As a matter of fact, African design is as much a figment of imagination as a European poem. That's surely why the curatorial team chose Making Africa as a title, rather than putting anything like African design in front. And yet, Making Africa, I think, is a wonderfully ambiguous, powerful, provocative, and possibly true title, as it suggests that Africa is yet to come. And in using making rather than made, there's another idea in the title which seems to be a leitmotif of the show, and that is that design is not a shape or a state. It is an ongoing process, an ongoing action, if you want. And its material, the material of this process, is life itself, to paraphrase Choo, who is an author in the catalog and advisor of the exhibition. So we are very happy that the curatorial team worked, or maybe found, this very contemporary and comprehensive understanding of design. And I think this show, you will see, is it's not about furniture, fashion and website, but it's much rather about the social and the emancipatory potential of design. Design as a reform of presence, oder im Deutschen Reform der Gegenwart. Because a lot of the works on show deal with exactly this question. How can design change the here and now of cities, of images, of identity, of ideology, of gender, and by doing so, they make future. So this exhibition actually raises a very interesting question. It raises a lot of questions, but this is a tiny one. That is, do we actually invent future or do we make future? The difference between inventing and making might appear tiny, but for the understanding of design as a responsibility and a social responsibility, it seems to be quite decisive. As a last point, I would like to emphasize once more that the Foundation was particularly pleased that the Vitra Museum relied from the very beginning on the advice, the expertise, and the cooperation with curators, designers, architects, urbanists, artists from the African continent and its diasporas. For reasons of historical adequacy and politics of representation, to mention just 2 points, there is no other way to go about it. It's been far too long that Africa makers and Africa narrators have come from beyond the continent, so it's time to listen. So we hope that in idea, in concept, in approach, this great exhibition should inspire a lot more projects of this kind, and we are waiting for them and hope they will get and reach us. So finally, I would like to thank all those who make this project possible. Thank you for your curiosity, your endurance, and for your trust in this project. And I hope that this show has a great success here in Weil am Rhein and in Bilbao and beyond. Thank you very much for your attention.
I don't have much to add. I already introduced Okwe and Amelie. And actually during the press conference today, they had a very interesting disagreement. Okwe said it's an exhibition not about design, but about art. And Amelie said, well, it's an exhibition about design. So I think there couldn't be a greater occasion to start this discussion. And I'm sure we will speak about that.
Welcome everybody. Thank you for coming. I was actually going to start with something else. I was going to confront you, Okwe, with a statement made by one of the designers slash artists slash musicians slash filmmakers slash whatever you want to call him, that I met in Nairobi, Choo, who said, Africa is a trend right now, and he adds, which is a terrible thing to say, but it is. I did ask you that question once already, and you gave me a very interesting answer.
I don't know if I quite remember what my answer was.
I can remind
in
you.
The kind of litany of things that I may have said. But let me begin first by, saying thank you, Amelie, and to Mathieu for inviting me to join your conversation and letting me listen in, giving me the opportunity to learn about the way you think about design, its relevance in the current context of what might call the global permanent transition, if you will, and I've learned a lot from it. And to the question about that Africa is a trend, I think the question is, when has it never been a trend? I think we seem to, if I recall my response, that it's a kind of cyclical thing in which Africa sort of appears and disappears. It's kind of a kind of curve, and which beginning at the turn of the 20th century, it was a rage that had its own particular resonance, within the work of the so-called European historical avant-garde. And of course, we've lived through moments of transition of Africa in relation to its potential and the potential of the post-colonial moment that has also bequeathed us with a number of design initiatives, some of them white elephants, many of which are now being rediscovered in terms of the very language of modern architecture, such as the exhibition you currently have. And I'm very gratified to see these two exhibitions next to each other. So the question is, why is it that a continent of this incredible scope and depth, become a trend? And I can understand from Jimmy Choo's position why he may be ambivalent about that. Because there is something a little bit, I should not say paternalistic about making it a trend, because I think that, there's a backdrop of our own desires that are projected onto it. And I must tell you that, we've lived through many of these moments, but I hope that the trend is really finally here to stay.
I do agree. Interestingly, you spoke about the Cubists and Gauguin and the early modernists who were inspired by Africa, and when Africa was a trend once already. And I think the parallel that we can see here is that these are moments of change. And I think it is quite interesting that Africa seems to rise whenever Europe and maybe America are kind of insecure in their dead certainties, and that in the moment when they come to realize that their model doesn't work, they keep looking at Africa. Do you agree?
Well, I think there are many points of reference. We can always learn from many references, and I think it's important not to fetishize Africa as a locus of some kind of deep knowledge in this sense. I mean, I think there are things to learn from Africa. There are things to unlearn from Africa. But I think the important thing is really to build into our own relationship to whatever we consider Africa to be, a more self-critical position. And Africa is always a foil for self-invention. And I suppose it's also a foil that has a certain kind of therapeutic dimension, for many people from the West, not just simply a place to learn. There's a kind of therapeutic dimension to it. So if one were to have a crisis in one's life, such as Lindsay Lohan, you travel to a slum in Nairobi, hold a baby, be photographed with a baby, and so on. So there's a kind of therapy to it. So we have to ask, what is the kind of cure that Africa injects when one decides to sort of to take on this journey, to the continent? But I think there was a talk I participated in last year with Rem Koolhaas and others in Venice. And I think, that it's really time to learn to reject that, that Africa needs something from the world or from the West, I think, we should start marking that envelope, return to sender. In this sense, we should start marking that envelope, return to sender, because we have seen, let me give you a perfect example, and I think it's kind of the kind of gallows humor that Africans can have, and to really use that gallows humor for a kind of self-critical approach. In Lagos, there's a huge second-hand market for electronics and other goods, called Tokumbo. And we've talked about this, and and the Tokumbo is sort of like, shall we say, a kind of where all the leftovers, are kind of, deposited. And Nigeria had the good sense recently sort of to ban many of these, defunct, cars and so on, because of the high level of pollution and toxic waste it deposits in the continent. So we really have to be, aware that, that Africa cannot be anymore a dumping ground for some of these initiatives, but to work in a more collaborative fashion with African, with Africans as individuals, with institutions. That is certainly the way I approach my own work, from the basis of collaboration. But I think that what makes this particular exhibition for me very, very interesting and unique is not just simply the consultative process, but the research that you've invested in bringing this about, talking to people who are your peers, talking to people who are your interlocutors, sharing ideas and building a kind of common ground of those ideas. I think that's the only way this kind of project can ever really take root within the kind of epistemological field that you call design.
You spoke about returning specific ideas to the sender. Now I'm going to, I would like to look at one moment in time when Africa started to return.
Koyo there?
She totally looks like Koyo. Now that you mention it, Koyo, is she here? Not yet.
She's somewhere here.
Here she is. I would like to talk to you about this, a moment in time when Africa once already started sending back those messages to the sender, and that was in the early post-colonial days, when Africa really celebrated itself and its independence. And this research of, or this new generation today, that is also celebrating Africa and itself. And I think I would like to know, I mean, there is a power in celebrating someone, it's, I would like to know your approach.
I'm never one for celebration, to be quite honest. I'm never one for celebration in the sense, because I think we need to be wary of the notion that Africa has to celebrate itself. I think there's a lot of work to be done in Africa. There are many questions we're still unraveling and, trying to find solutions to. But what for me is very interesting that sometimes I ask myself, what if we don't get it right? What if we do not become like, any other city with a street that has the same, luxury companies from, luxury, shops from two companies based in Paris? What if we don't get it right? Will the world end? So we need to sort of really begin thinking about what is, what we find valuable, not just simply what to celebrate. Because I think it's very easy to, delude ourselves in only process of self-affirmation. Because this process of self-affirmation immediately points to the fact that there must be some deficits that we want to sort of, conceal. So I think it's important that we, don't get lost in this, game of self-affirmation, because it makes us feel good. There are many, many important things that are happening in Africa, and there are many incredible, shifts that are taking place. There's an incredible resilience. There's an incredible imaginative scope. And these are the things I'm interested in, this big imaginative scope of Africans. And I think this is what you find. That's why the continent is thriving. Despite all the kind of the doomsday, all the kinds of things that you read in the media. I mean, look at the population explosion. Africa has the kind of the obverse of what's happening in Europe, where you have population decline. And, Africa was supposed to have been wiped out a long time ago. So let's really look at that potential. But I think it's too early to get into kind of self-congratulatory, process and self-affirmation. Because it plays, to the vanities, if you will, of NGOs. I think we need to really be very critical of appealing to these vanities.
You suggest that we should not only look at the continent in a different way, but also use terminology in a different way. Why do you think these redefinitions are important and necessary?
Well, I think, societies change. Mathieu spoke about the fact that Vitra Museum is interested in the role that design plays in economic, social, political, and cultural, change and social change. So as our view of the world changes, so must the terminologies, that we cannot be really stuck in one place using the same terminologies. Let me just, by the way, say something to the effect that I am not anti-ethnographic museums, actually. I'm not against them. I think it's a vast field of knowledge that one can, play with. But I think one has to reinvent that language. And I just recently opened an exhibition with David Ajay, the architect in Munich. And David, made a statement for me that was very, very crucial and interesting. And he said that there are a huge range of conceptual references in Africa that nobody's making use of. He might as well use them himself, because it's such a huge, vital resource, abstract concepts. And they've really been very, very important, germinal for his own architectural practice. If you look at the design of Rivington Place in London, with the kind of faceted roof top, that design comes from the kind of faceted side of a Liberian mask. It's just so amazing. And there are all these kind of, different frames of reference that one can use. So the terminology has to be what was formerly seen to be ethnographic might actually mean something entirely different in terms of its conceptual references. And that is why the terms themselves, are always pregnant with new meaning. And what do we do with the new meaning that we invest in terminologies that, before may have completely different connotation? I'll give you one more example from David's work, which is this building that will open, that will kind of complete the 200-year master plan of the National Mall in Washington, D.C. David is, building the last building that will be built on the National Mall, the National Museum for African American History and Culture. And so what he identified was that when you look on the National Mall, there are several profiles. There's the obelisk, there is the dome, and he wanted to add a third profile. And there's this three-tiered corona. And where did this three-tiered corona come from? It comes from a shrine post carved in Nigeria at the turn of the 20th century by Olowe of Ise. And it's a double post with a hunter and a diviner on each side. But on top of the corona of the sculptures is these three, abstract ziggurats. And this is what really defined this third profile. And you wouldn't know at all because it seems so completely contemporary. And so there are many lessons that one can learn from Africa. And I think that an architect like David has this incredible confidence to be able to make contemporary architecture of such cultural and shall I say architectural significance by looking at some of this. So these are, for me, examples that are important to sort of to think about when we really try to investigate and invest the old terminologies with new meaning.
So you gave us a glossary, I would say, of new words for the catalog, and I would like to
don't do that to me. I can't sit down quick on my feet.
I'm sure you will know what I'm referring to. So you gave us a new meaning to a lot of words and terms that are used in design very commonly, and you completely reframed them. And one of them is making, to make. And since we speak about making Africa, I would like to quote you. So what you were saying is, making is challenging the complacency of mass production. And I've quoted you many times since you first said that.
Yeah, I mean, I do believe in that, simply because, especially in the context of being more ecologically responsible, for places where many different ways of making remain the ways that people have access to design. I think that making, for me, as opposed to mass production, is something to be recovered. In the 50s and the 60s, the Ibeji figures in Yoruba Nigeria started being replaced by plastic dolls. So you can go to the market and buy 2 plastic dolls, one blue and one red, and you can join them and make an Ibeji figure. But they are vastly inferior to the incredible nuance of those small Ibeji sculptures by the Yoruba. The Ibeji, by the way, is supporting the cult of twins in Yoruba culture. So, but I think that he also speaks of the inventiveness of use of mass-produced material. But oftentimes I think when you replace the carved figure with the plastic dolls, there's a kind of loss of meaning. There's a kind of loss of of technique, if you will.
There's another really important word that is like a red thread to many of the pieces that we see in the exhibition, and that is informality. This is a piece that shows two cogwheels, and the smaller one being the informal city driving the formal city. And what you said is we should harness the understanding of informality as one of the great engine blocks for the orientation of Africa. Would you like to add something?
Well, it is really definitely the case, because when you really look at a GP, what's it called? Gross national GNP of many African, countries. For so many years, you always read about a family of 10 surviving on $1 a day, and recently, Africans got a raise. It's now $1.50. It's now $1.50 a day. Africans got a raise. But I think that if you really look at the huge dimension of the so-called informal economy, it's not possible that this kind of growth, numbers that we've heard, that this growth is possible without the informal economy, the inventiveness of that. And therefore, we really need to find this is one that really begs for rethinking the terminology and invest in that terminology with a completely new, model of quantification. And I think that this piece, in my view, really, speaks directly to it.
And also, of course, the fact of taking whatever resources available and then making something. So both terms go well together in a way.
Yeah, but taking whatever is available is also about decision making. There's a process of selection and rejection. You just don't take whatever. There's a process of recalibrating those resources to make those resources speak a new language. You see Ella Nasi's work and so on. So I think there is much more than just simply using whatever is at hand. There are decisions that that support those choices, and I think it's by looking at those decisions that we can better understand the function of the informality, as it were.
We have Ella Nasi's work in the background now, and it is a nice transition to what I was going to ask you next. Oftentimes, design in Africa is seen through the lens of recycling, which is, of course, utter nonsense for the reasons that you just mentioned. Ella Natsui is obviously using these materials because these are the materials that he's using, period.
Well, you probably know much more about this than I do, since you're a design expert. But I think there are so many design networks in Africa, and I think that really have nothing to do with recycling, from the northern part of Nigeria to the eastern part of Nigeria, there are so many design cultures. So it's very difficult to, or even if you go to South Africa or to Kenya, I use another example from David because I think it's important. The Bernie Grant, Center has this skin of kind of a weave pattern, and which basically, David borrowed from the Rwandan, hand-woven thread mat. It's just simply to give it that skin. It's just so fabulous, and the abstraction of that in the middle of London, So there are many design cultures. So I don't think that we should really only sort of think about design culture in terms of how people use material alone, because there's still innovation that is going on within even traditional, craft and of course design, cultures, whether it's in South Africa, whether it's in Libya, Niger, Senegal, Cameroon, I mean, it's just there's such wealth, such diversity of design cultures, and I think it would be very, very hard to exhaust them. But I think that what's important about this particular show is it's really speaking directly to design in the present. It's speaking to design in the present, design that is made not just for Africans, but design that is made just because, you know, the people making them, you know, have the skill, they have the knowledge, they have the aptitude, they have the network, and they're really building an incredible, reserve of new information that makes it possible to make an exhibition of this kind.
There's another thing that I would like to speak to you about and ask you about, and that's style. Now, style is a word that makes a lot of design experts cringe, because they think that design is, of course, not style. But I think that you gave it a very interesting twist, saying that it's just going beyond what the life, has offered you, and just being not content with what you seem to have, but going beyond that.
Yeah, I mean, you know, style. You know, what a prosaic term, but also a very elusive term. Again, I sort of, you know, think of style not in the kind of generic way that you know, one thinks about it, but it's, you know, about the ways which, you know, through, you know, which people make their way through life, and in particular, you know, style in an African context is really not homogenized. It's so individual. In the kind of conventional way in which we think about style. It's so individual. And I did say something else about style than what you said. If you remind me of that, I think it was much more precise.
Goyo said something really different about style too. She said that style is basically everything is style on the continent, and that it goes way beyond dressing or anything like that. But it's the way how people deal with each other, how they greet each other, and it's a way of living and of interacting and
Did you go to Bamako when you were researching?
No,
okay, because if you are going to talk about the way you greet people, to go to Bamako, and you run into somebody on the street, and you know, and of course the exchange, you say hello, and the person say hello back to you, and they will spend the next 2 minutes, you know, saying hello, asking you about each member. Then at the end, you return the favor. I mean, there's this, you know, what for me is very fascinating about that type of greeting is the time invested, is the dimension of slowness to it. It's not high, you know, the dimension of slowness, and that sense, that space between greeting and slowing down is really incredibly attractive. That it takes about, you know, 4 minutes or 5 minutes to greet somebody. I mean, there's just something really quite, you know, interesting in a moment where, you know, quote unquote time, you know, is money.
I agree, yeah. And finally, I would also like to ask you about the future. And there's a quote, and you answered something, and it's now in the exhibition as a quote. And you said, the future, to think about the future is to think about one's own possibility in life. Mm-hmm. And I think this is beautiful, and I would like you to talk a little bit about that.
Well, I did add something else that, you know, I think I'm not the only one who said it, but maybe it's one of those moments of self-affirmation
You did say that. I have it on video.
Yeah, moments of self-affirmation that, you know, that comes loaded with its own traps, which I say that, you know, that the future belongs to Africa because the future seems to have happened everywhere else, you know. Because I think that is the context, because, you know, Africa is always the last place we imagine that needs to catch up. So that when we think about the future, maybe the future is already the past in many places, and, you know, so Africa is poised to be, you know, on an eternal springboard.
And the graffiti that we see on the museum's wall right now is, the title of it in Wolof, I hope I get it right, is Ëllëg si tey, which means the future is today.
Yeah. Well, there's another quote you have that I like very much. I don't know who said it. It's that we face neither east nor west. We face forward. I think that's beautiful.
And we face, I think, west now, towards the museum. And I would like to thank you, and I would like to thank you all. And I would like to invite you to go and see the show and enjoy, and I hope you will go in with one set of questions and get out of it with another set of questions and maybe a new perspective onto Africa.